MJ, for that kind remarks. I don't normally get too nervous, but having MJ to moderate the session, I have to be extremely careful. Now, I don't need to convince Indians about the virtues of democracy, but I need to caution fellow Democrats about the despotism and tyranny of the majority, about the expectations for India in this region and in the country where I come from. I begin by quoting the great Filipino Asian hero, Jose Rizal. I rate him as a precursor for Asian Renaissance. Humanity will not be redeemed while reason is not free. I'm not reading the text. So bear with me. I mean, I can distribute if the India Today Conclave insists that I do distribute the text. But our concern is to ensure that this whole clamor for reform and democracy remains true and meaningful to the ideals of the great promoters of democracy. It's not confined to just Jeffersonian ideals or what has been crafted by Tocqueville as habits of the heart. Relevant, true. You are familiar with the politics of conscience of Gandhiji, which I strongly believe in. It's not just a concert of the rich and powerful to be able to win elections and betray the trust of the people. Indonesia has transformed itself after decades of dictatorship into somewhat a vibrant democracy. I'm a great fan of Indonesia in terms of this transformation. Turkey in the Muslim world is seen in a very positive light. But Indonesia, as India has seen, its greatness lies in its total commitment for free expression and democratic rule. Its challenge lies because the system has not been able to deal with the issues of endemic corruption and the glaring disparity between the very rich and the very poor, marginalization of societies, and unreason, as expounded by many political leaders. We have seen the Arab Spring, the total clamor for reform, the energy, as you have seen, which is unprecedented. And mind you, the Arab world, in the Arab Spring, some consider that Arab Spring, most now would like to refer it to the uprising, people's uprising. But it is timely that our friends, while struggling to undertake the reform, saying ruthless despotics, dictators, and in the last, you see the manner Bashar Assad continue to shoot and murder his own people, whilst having to deal with these issues and the clamor for reform, it is timely that our friends experienced the Arab Spring look at the success of India and the challenges that you face and Occupy Wall Street. Because Occupy Wall Street is a movement not clamoring for democracy or freedom, but looking at the excesses of unbridled capitalistic system that prove that in a democracy, in a vibrant capitalism, you may find a complicity between the rich conglomerates and the corrupt political elite. The strength in the United States society whatever misgivings one may have, is that you can still navigate, you can still have, you do hear strong movement clamoring for reform and ensuring that change do take place. Our concerns we see in these sort of societies is particularly where we are in Asia, is whether we can show that we are able to resolve many of these outstanding challenges. I don't think, and I don't ever believe, that the option is Asian values promoted by Mahathir, Kuan Yew, Suharto, and the rest, condescending view towards citizens, leaders know best. And I think that's a change. Even in Singapore, we have proven to be remarkably successful in terms of managing its economy, in terms of its effective measures against excesses and corruption and abuse of power. But even then, you can find a strong clamor for change and demand that people are given basic rights and freedom and democratic rule. Malaysia is, of course, struggling. I'll reserve my comments on Malaysia because I'll be deemed to be more biased. But I remain optimistic, and I can speak here, being interviewed by the media. But I, as leader of the opposition in Malaysia, do not have even 1 minute of airtime in Malaysia. We call it democracy all the same. So that is why one of the reasons why I accepted this India Today Conclave. The only opportunity I can get some TV interviews. Although I was given a choice between listening to Kareena Kapoor and having a photo session with her and having this TV interview, unfortunately, I had to choose to be interviewed. And I missed that opportunity. But my wife said, never mind, because it may lead to another scandal to be charged. So let me just emphasize the need to support the movement for reform and democracy. How do I see India in the midst of all this? I've always held these high expectations. We grew up in Malaysia. Of course, Indian history is part and parcel of our Asian history. And you know, this enormous influence of, they call it even Indianization of the region. I mean, I'm talking in the historical, cultural sense. But there's been hardly any interest to promote these ideals, these politics of conscience, that to my mind is very much a part and parcel of the fabric of Indian ethics and values. I've tried very hard, talking to my colleagues here, some of my friends, to say that India, without the necessity of being directly involved in the politics of different countries, Burma or elsewhere, but to be seen, to be true to the ideals and aspirations of its founding fathers, to be able to articulate a case for freedom and democracy. Yes, you have intellectuals, you have journalists like M.J. Akbar, you have intellectual luminary like Amartya Sen, who has done remarkably well in terms of proving the case and rejecting this obsolete notion of Asian values and any form of dictatorship or authoritarian rule. But the political leadership, engrossed with endless issues of corruption, has failed in their task in promoting these ideals of democracy. You have one of the best judicial systems in the region, in fact, in the world. Throughout my case in the last 1.5 decades, we have my counsel always making reference to some of the most brilliant judgments by the Indian courts, and particularly the Supreme Court. But there's hardly any effort to try and promote the institution of independent judiciary to the region. You have a free media. And I know leaders, political leaders, do not necessarily like the notion of free media. But this is a role which I think the Indian leadership has failed. Effective measures to combat corruption remain to be central, because the failure of good governance, transparency, accountability means a growing cynicism towards democratic rule. That's why I think this spells danger. In Jakarta, you have this enormous debate. Why do we need to change that system and support reformasi? Because we are not getting good returns. Because you continue to marginalize the society. You have endemic poverty. You use reform the economy to enrich a small group of elites and allow this Gini coefficient growing gap of the very rich and the very poor. So I think, to my mind, these are challenges we have to deal. I'm fortunate that I'm able to learn as much as possible from these experiences and need to unlearn many of these dogmatic normative modes which would be essential in terms of promoting what I refer to as good governance. I was here last month in Panchgani with Rajmohan Gandhi, and I think why I was particularly attracted to this, because I think politics must remain relevant only when it's tied to central issue and a case of morality and ethical principles and values. And that's very much Indian. That's very much the core of Indian politics in the past. And I think we need to continue to promote that, because what happens in India, mind you, its ramification is far greater than what you do envisage. The debate whether to choose the Indian model, the Chinese model, Asian values or democracy, is because the failure of many of the democratic regimes. If we are able to perform economically vibrant, with good governance, and true to democracy, democratic ideals and values, then I don't think people have a choice. Given half a choice, those from Egypt to Tunisia to Syria, after 5-6 decades of dictatorial rule, would opt for freedom and democracy, whatever the limitations you may say. Because for those of us, and I in particular, having had some experience under solitary confinement, will realize, and when I talk about democracy, I talk with passion. When I talk about justice, I believe in it. It's a sense of conviction. It's not just a theoretical construct. It's not just a political agenda. It is a passion, because you know what it means to be unfree. You know what it means to work and struggle in a society or state or country where there is no media freedom. You know what it feels, how to deal with a judiciary that works under the thumb of the executive. It's not just a Western construct, as some would allege. In Malaysia, anytime you talk about democracy, then they say it's an American stooge. If you talk about freedom, then it becomes essentially a Jewish conspiracy, and you have heard this before. And you tend to talk about pluralism, multiculturalism, or attending Pongal harvest festival, then you become pro-Hindu. And there's no opportunity whatsoever to counter and place reason because of the lack of or absence of a free media. So I mean, a series of questions that I've raised, and hopefully I'll be able to listen to some of your views and advice. I remain an optimist. Even in the worst of times with Azizah, they're holding the fort, I've always believed in the wisdom of the masses. It's fortunate that other than Gandhi, one of the great philosophers that I read when I was very young was Ortega Why Gasset, Rebellion de las Masas, Revolt of the Masses. You must have, to be a true Democrat, you must believe and trust in the wisdom of the masses. Thank you very much.
You live on the eastern end of a Muslim world that starts from Morocco and moves up to Indonesia. A question which people ask, but sometimes find it almost impolite to ask publicly, but I'm going to ask it. Why do Muslim nations not have democracy? What is it? Is there something in the faith? Is there something in the history? Is there something in the culture? Why?
Shukriya mere dosti. The things I know is muhabbat, pyar, zindagi. That's enough to survive.
There's no fourth word.
They say you have to dream. And ha hotum ya koi hakikat kon hotum batlao. Between the dream and the hakikat. So you have to measure that. Anyway, the reality, the hakikat, is not what you suggest, MJ. In 1955, Indonesia, the largest Muslim country in the world, organized a free, fair elections, only to be hijacked later because of the Cold War politics under Sukarno. And I used to joke in front of former Vice President Al Gore that the elections in Indonesia in 1955 was far more free and fair than Florida in the year 2000. So don't tell us about the Muslim concern, or resentment or fear, or talk about Islam and compatibility between Islam and democracy. Now, India is the second largest Muslim country in the world. And Muslims here in the internal debate dynamics don't question whether we should support democracy or not. So you cannot discount the role Muslims here in India in their willingness to participate in the entire political process. And now, of course, you have Turkey, a vibrant democracy, relatively more successful economically. So I think the failure of particularly the Middle East, the Arab world, to come to terms with these new democratic demands is the failure of leadership. You have dictators, rulers, not only incompetent, but ruthless and autocratic. And unfortunately, in the geopolitical sense, they have been supported all this while by the greatest democracy on earth, the United States of America. Mossadegh in Iran was relatively more democratic, and he won in the democratic elections, only to be hijacked by the British Petroleum or the CIA, those things, whatever. So I think we must therefore accept the fact that this is essentially a universal agenda. It's not quite true or right to suggest that Muslims have anathema or difficulty in accepting democracy. Yes, there are aberrations. There are perpetrators or purveyors of violence which must be dealt firmly, because you must have law and order in society. And you know, you come from this region, you know, Pakistan, Afghanistan, for example. But to my mind, if you talk clearly in terms of democracy, give them half the chance, they will opt for democracy and democratic reforms.